record this for folks. So I'll be recording the content of the meeting from this point forward for the benefit of folks who have to join us later. But some general updates, scores for the motivation and emotion unit are posted. As you can see from the score distribution here, overall, the test went fairly well for people, but there were some folks who, despite the modification of being able to use their notes and whatnot, maybe still struggled on this test. And some of that might be from, of course, the reduced class time that we had to work with this material. But some of it may be just stuff that we missed in our preparation too. So retakes are going to look a little bit different this time around. I know some of you are interested in that. Because you got to use your notes on the original test, and because I will be allowing you to update and modify your notes when you do the retake, we're going to do one attempt on that. You want to make sure that you've got yourself ready to go for a good retake so it doesn't drag out kind of endlessly for people, especially given all the like crazy schedule stuff we've got going on. So you can, if you are interested, you will be able to do a retake and you get one shot at it. You will have to do test corrections, and the test correction form is going to look a little different this time because of that modification of being able to use your notes. So in particular, this unit's test correction form is going to force you to kind of look at, okay, this content that I needed to know in order to answer this question, was it in my notes? And if not, why? You know, did I miss one of the snow day lessons? Did I fail to read one of the assigned modules or something? Well, okay, that seems fixable, right? If it was just that you actually didn't understand some content that was required to answer a question, you know, obviously we'll need to go over that to make sure you do understand the important theories from last unit. We're going to aim to finish those up by the end of next week. You know, yeah. Like, hopefully the weather cooperates with that. If you're one of those individuals who's looking forward to going to New Orleans next week as part of the music trip, I'd recommend just looking ahead to your pacing guide at what reading modules are going to be due and making sure that you've done those in advance of your departure, because no one wants to bring I mean, I know you love your psych textbook, like we all do, but you know, you probably don't want to haul it with you all the way to New Orleans. And that way you won't have anything to worry about as you travel. So if you have other questions about that, I will have handouts and stuff for you next week, because I'll be doing my, I'll be doing all my copying hopefully this weekend. So hopefully we'll have you ready to go, but you can help work on getting yourself ready to go by making sure those reading quizzes are done. So with that being said, let's maybe focus on our big task together today. You might want to, like, there'll be some kind of notesy types of things. And of course, we'll be looking at your responses to that survey that I had posted earlier. The personality unit, which is the one that we're starting on, is one of my absolute favorites to teach. So I hope that we do get to spend time in class together working on it rather than having to do it remotely all the time. So the big task of our next few minutes together is that I want to get you oriented to like how this topic is studied in personality, because that'll help you be able to move into your reading for this unit in a way that's hopefully going to help you. And also so you're not weirded out by Freud, because Freud and the psychoanalytic approach is really the first of the major theories that you're going to encounter this unit. And Freud does tend to weird people out. And fair enough, like some of his ideas are a little unsavory. So that's understandable. So, okay, first up, just personality in general. Always our first learning objective for any given unit is to know what even is the topic that we're trying to study. So if it's a unit on motivation, what's motivation? If it's a unit on intelligence, what's intelligence? And as your textbook is going to point out for you, personality, if you like locked a bunch of personality theorists and researchers in a room, they would probably be able to agree, you know, within some reasonable limits, with what personality is. So we kind of define it as people's characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. So it's a combination of your behaviors and your thoughts that hopefully are consistent, over maybe situation to situation or over time in your life. It doesn't include, by that definition, it's not going to include stuff like temporary states. So being hungry, it doesn't include physical characteristics. So like one's appearance, that doesn't count. But a lot of other things that people do, or at least tend to do, fall under the umbrella of personality. And it does distinguish individuals from each other, which is part of what makes it interesting. But as we're going to see, even though most of the theorists from this unit agree on this general definition of what personality is, they wildly disagree on how personality develops, and even the important stuff that you might need to take into account when trying to distinguish one person's personality from another. Okay, I'm just realizing that the snow is like giving like super weird glare on my glasses, so I'm going to take them off because I can operate fine without them. So that's not a weird reflection for you. I'm sitting near a window. So what we're going to do next here, we're going to sneak a peek at people's responses. Oh, great. Look at all the people that were able to respond to this. Okay. And maybe if you're viewing this later, there'll actually be more responses available for you to review. But had we been in class together, I would have actually given you a paper version of this form. And then you would have actually lined up or gone to different places in the room with, to indicate whether you agreed or disagreed with a particular statement. So I'm sorry you don't get that version of it, because this is kind of fun. It gets into some big questions in personality. But if you notice, some of the things on that survey that you filled out are statements that maybe contradict each other. Or people's responses to them could be contradictory of each other. So this idea that like your basic personality doesn't change from situation to situation, we were all over the place in that. A lot of us expressing kind of moderate disagreement with it. But look at the diversity of opinions people have about that. Personality and whether it's possible to change after adolescence. Again, lots of diverse responses here, people feeling differently about this. And researchers in psychology actually will give you different answers to that question depending on the personality theory that they're operating from and the type of research that they're drawing from. Some personality traits do seem to maybe change over time, and others don't, depending on how you're measuring them. You may have noticed even this one. It's possible to completely forget something that's simply too painful to remember. You may recognize that concept as being, it's hinting at a concept we learned about earlier this year in the memory unit called repression. The empirical support for that is weak, but the idea of repression and the idea that some things are unconscious to us, especially uncomfortable stuff, is kind of foundational to our psychoanalytic approach. So too is this. Your adult personality is influenced by many unconscious forces rooted in early childhood experience. Look at this. We had a lot of people. This would be probably strong to moderate agreement, because like our neutral middle ground is here. A lot of people tended to, in general, agree with that from those of you that have filled this out so far, it looks like. And that's interesting, because that is an idea that's foundational to Freud's notions about how personality develops. The interesting implication of this idea is that if our personality is rooted in unconscious forces that maybe we don't have conscious access to, and those things happen in early childhood, that means personality is not as easily changed. And it also suggests that maybe some of those unconscious forces might be kind of like dark if those early childhood experiences were traumatic or involved conflicts that weren't resolved. The last one I wanted to draw your attention to, and I just want to check out how you respond to, oh yes, look at this. Okay, this statement, everyone strives to be happy and successful. This is a statement that when I have people respond to it in class and we check people's attitudes about it, we do tend to see, I have a lot of students who in general express agreement about this, because, okay, who wouldn't want to be happy, right? Like striving to be happy and successful seems like a reasonable goal in life. If you found a lot of affinity with that statement, so you tend to agree with it a lot, you might really like some of the theorists that we're going to encounter from our humanistic approach, because this concept is absolutely fundamental. This assumption that we're innately good and that we strive toward betterment is fundamentally embedded in the idea of the humanistic approach to personality. But it's also fundamentally opposite of Freud's ideas about how personality worked. He thought human beings kind of at their core were pretty dark, and that they were likely to engage in nefarious things if left unrestrained. So, the nice thing about studying personality is that there's kind of something for everybody. There's so many contradictory opinions and ideas embedded within these theories that you're probably going to find your own theoretical home. Like you might find that, oh, I really agree with the humanistic folks, or, I really think the social cognitive folks, they've got it figured out. They understand how people work. And this gets us into some really deep questions about human beings, which is why I love teaching it. If you like deep existential questions that make you lie awake at night, questions like, why am I who I am? And how did I become this way? I mean, this unit gets you into those. So it's awesome. But it's also necessarily complex because the theorists in personality are attempting to account for the entire person. And so they don't have the luxury of just paying attention to intelligence or motivation, or states of consciousness, some very limited but important area of human psychological functioning. They have to try and account for everything about you, which is going to be difficult. And that's why the theories get a little convoluted. So let's take a look at this slide here to give you a big picture overview of what this unit's going to look like as we dive into it. As you step through your reading, you're going to be progressing first through some historical approaches to understanding personality, starting with the psychoanalytic approach, which is the work of Sigmund Freud. So we're going to dive heavy into Freud because his ideas are pretty complex and pretty terminology heavy to begin with. In fact, you might have already noticed your first reading module quiz for this unit was not due like for today if you're an A-Day student, or for tomorrow if you're a B-Day student. It's actually scheduled to be due Sunday night for A-Day students and Monday night for B-Day students, because module 55 is longer. Freud has a bunch of different concepts and terminology associated with his work. So, we need time to work through that. So even though it's not due, think about getting started on your snow day. We'll follow that up by taking a look at the humanistic approach, the work of Rogers and Maslow. And then the later modules in the unit will get you introduced to some more modern perspectives on personality. The trait theorists, as the name suggests, do try and understand human personality in the context of fundamental traits. So patterns of behavioral tendency that you can name and separate from each other. And the social cognitive folks, the name kind of implies this, suggests that they take into account our thinking about situations in our social environment. And you're going to see some familiar faces show up that unit. But you might take a moment today to take a look at some of the other links that are posted in Canvas, and hopefully I have those posted correctly. So if I don't, let me know. Because one of the things that's worth noting is in our learning objectives here for this unit, we have a return to studying lots of people. Once again, look at all these different, I'll load on my screen in a moment. There we go. Okay, look at all these different people. We are going to have to deliberately work on studying people and their names and contributions this unit. And all of the learning objectives that you're going to find are kind of separated by the theory that they go with. In fact, I also have linked for you in Canvas a copy of something that you'll be getting a paper copy of this. You'll also be getting a paper copy of your learning objectives in class. But you'll be getting a paper copy of this gigantic theory grid in class. And we're going to be using that both in review and sometimes during class to try and sort out for each of these perspectives that we're going to encounter. I mean, who are the key people that go with that? What are the key fundamental underlying assumptions of that model, which are going to be really different. Like Freud over here is going to be like, human beings are dark, they're driven by unconscious forces. The humanistic folks are going to be like, human beings are good, and they strive for betterment and achievement. There's going to be really different assumptions underlying these things, which we're going to need to be familiar with. We're also going to have specific concepts and terminology associated with each of the different theories that are aligned specifically with that theory. So just as you, especially as you're reading and as you're preparing your notes, if you're the kind of person that likes Quizlet or using flashcards, if you like making yourself vocabulary lists to do your studying, it's worth noting the big challenge here is you don't want to just know what that vocabulary term is this unit. You want to also know what theory it's associated with. So if you like color coding, this is a great opportunity for you, because maybe you want to mark all the psychoanalytic ideas like in red, and the humanistic ones in blue, and trait theory in green or something. That might help you get used to the idea that when you're responding to questions about trait theory, you've got to kind of draw on the concepts and terms from that perspective, not other areas. Same thing for social cognitive or psychoanalyst or psychoanalysis. So some challenges, but challenges that we'll tackle together, and that'll help you like understand the complexity of human personality, which I think is really, really valuable for to study and to understand. And it looks like, I mean, I don't have any questions in the chat stuff coming in yet. So by all means, jump in and give me one if you want me to slow down and you miss something, or if I wasn't explaining it correctly. Because during our last few minutes together here, I want to get you at least a tiny bit oriented to who you're going to be reading about in Module 55, because the psychoanalytic approach to personality, always that name we should mentally associate with Sigmund Freud. And we've kind of been dabbling or dancing around Freud for the entire year to this point, because his ideas actually came up in a whole bunch of different places already. Like we learned about his theory of dreams in our states of consciousness unit. You learned about that concept of repression kind of when we studied cognition and memory back at the start of the year. Sorry, I had a brain glitch there. But so Freud's kind of been on the sidelines for a long time, but we're going to dive heavily into his theories this unit, which, you know, sometimes people find Freud really unsavory and alarming, and I don't want you to be too alarmed by him. I think you'll actually, even if you choose ultimately to disagree with every single one of his ideas, which you are welcome to do. Like there have been people that have completely, like almost completely rejected Freud in their understandings of humans. Some people don't agree with him much at all. But even if you don't agree with him, it's important to know where he's coming from. And look at him here on the screen. Okay, this is Mr. Freud. Pictured always with a cigar. He had a terrible cigar smoking problem that ultimately ended up killing him, and that's a story for later. But Freud always looks super scowly in his pictures, and there's a reason for that. This is a guy who actually understood man's dark potential because he came face to face with it. And understanding his early work and the patients that he was working with will help you understand like where he, like how he ultimately went down the path he did with all of his convoluted theories. Because Freud was born to a Jewish family in a very anti-Semitic Europe. He was raised in Austria, spent most of his career in Vienna. And because of the fierce anti-Semitism of Europe in the late 1800s and early 20th century, there were many opportunities that were denied to him and his family. So he combated people's like hatred and anger on a daily basis. He felt that this was one of the reasons that people ultimately at first were reluctant to accept his ideas, because he considered himself, and he was kind of seen as an outsider to both psychology and to the medical community, because he was actually trained as a physician first, and he had wanted to go into research. He wanted to land a position at like a research university or institute, but because of both quotas and just anti-Semitism in general, those positions were often closed to Jewish professionals at the time. He also encountered in his lifetime horribly dark stuff. Like he lived through World War I in Europe. There were times when he actually had to, like times were so bad, he was accepting potatoes or food as payment from his patients instead of money, because there just was no money. All of his sons served in the Austrian army during World War I, and he feared daily for their lives. World War I saw millions of Europeans sent to their graves for seemingly like no good reason. So there were some dark times in there. He ended up fleeing Europe with the help of both the U.S. Embassy and other international maneuvering in the wake of World War II when the Nazis invaded Austria. All of his sisters ended up being sent to concentration camps and died there. So this was a person who understood man's dark potential because before him, he saw it realized. So I think we have to forgive him a little bit for the darkness of his worldview, because he lived through some really dark stuff. So if you start questioning like, well, how could Freud think that this is who people are? keep in mind the context in which he lived. He was operating just from different life experiences than most of us. And that also means like maybe some of his theories might not be as applicable by modern standards, but let's forgive him at least for that. So as you dive into the reading in Module 55, one of the things they're going to introduce is that Freud also worked in his early years as a physician with a very distinct patient group. He worked with patients that at the time would have been diagnosed with a condition known as hysteria. Today, people exhibiting these same symptoms would be diagnosed with something like maybe conversion disorder or a somatic symptom and related disorder type of condition, because they were expressing physical symptoms, so like the paralysis of an arm, like people not being able to move their arm, or sensory deficits, like not being able to see. Hysterical blindness is when people can't see, but it's not because of damage to the eye or any other nervous system deficit. Likewise, when people are paralyzed, but there's no nerve problem that would explain that paralysis. That's what hysteria was. And Freud, after working with these patients, came to believe that their problems actually were not physical, despite the fact that they were looking for physical causes, that their problems might actually stem back into childhood from unresolved unconscious conflicts or traumas. And this remains true. Like for people diagnosed with conversion disorder and somatic symptom disorder today, although those conditions now are more rare than they were during Freud's time, these are still things that are actually believed to be caused by psychological conflicts and problems that the person's not really yet ready to consciously confront. So his ideas about where the conflict is coming from kicked off this whole notion that maybe we should explore unconscious functioning in people, that maybe that's actually the driving force in personality. So he comes up with this notion of the unconscious. And the unconscious is not referring to a brain area. It's a theoretical mental construct that suggests like the bulk of our mental life is kind of suppressed beneath the surface. It's stuff that's not consciously accessible to us. And particularly like threatening thoughts, traumas, things that we don't really want to confront or acknowledge, that's where we shove them in Freud's ideas. But when we shove them there, they actually have an indirect effect on our behavior. So one of the things that you're going to encounter in your reading is this notion that we often use this iceberg model to demonstrate his thinking, that like icebergs, the bulk of them is beneath the surface of the water, and it's only a little bit that's above the surface. Freud thought that's how mental life was, that most of the important stuff is actually shoved down there beneath the surface, and that's actually what's driving our behavior. So things like especially repressed ideas, defense mechanisms, which we'll explore a little bit more next week, like all of that stuff is maybe where the important stuff is. And he believed that that's where like the good stuff was. Okay, I've got a request to go back for a screenshot. I can do that. Hold on here. Let's go back. You can screenshot this if you want, or the notes are going to be, this is being recorded, so I'm going to post it in Canvas for you as well. So if you needed to screenshot this, you certainly can, but you can always, go back to the recording too. So no worries about that. So hopefully people who needed that have taken care of it. This particular slide was actually my endpoint because I think I've gotten you enough that you'll be able to understand where Freud's coming from and kind of the fundamental core of his ideas as you start your reading. And hopefully I'll see you at least sometime tomorrow so that we can add more detail to this. We'll also, of course, be looking at motivation and emotion unit tests. So pretty soon we're going to run out of time in our allotted meeting space because we do only get 40 minutes for meetings. So we've only got a few minutes remaining. If you want to unmute and ask a question, you certainly can. Or if you have a question that you'd like to pose in the chat section, I'll pause for a moment to try and handle any of those as they come up. But other than that, I think we've got enough to get you started here today. As you do encounter your reading in Module 55, keep in mind that this is the big picture metaphor for Freud's work, that, most of the stuff is going to be beneath the surface. This is a model that entirely believes the driving force in human personality development is unconscious stuff, and unconscious stuff that might be even like stemming back to like early childhood stuff that we've pushed down there. So if you have questions, I'm happy to resolve them. Otherwise, if you've gotten what you've needed out of today, you can go ahead and leave the meeting. I will be closing it. We'll actually be forced to close it in a few minutes. So yeah, I hope today was helpful, and I hope I see you tomorrow.